This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
This is Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast. And today I'm talking with Peter Gärdenfors, who's one of our speakers in our summer school. And Peter, you presented your work in generalizing a theoretical framework that's called conceptual spaces towards language. So what's this notion of a conceptual space exactly?
It's a model of how you represent knowledge. I mean, I'm a cognitive scientist, and I want to understand, in some sense, how our minds represent knowledge. And we have different traditions. I mean, you have the symbolic approach of the early AI, and then you have the neural networks. My conceptual spaces is in something in between, because I work with geometric structures, with metrics, distances, vectors, and that kind of notions to model different kinds of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So can you give me an example of that?
Well, the normal example I use is the color space.
Mm-hmm.
We perceive colors, but we organize colors along 3 dimensions. I mean, there is the hue, the color circle going red, blue, green, yellow, and so on. And then there is a dark and light. And then there is the intensity going from gray. So there's the 3-dimensional space. And that's how we perceive colors. And it's fairly well established in psychophysics that we have this spatial arrangement of colors.
Mm-hmm. So, but now, in some sense, I could say, well, if I talk about an object having a certain color, like an apple being red, then this apple might have a number of properties. So it will be round, it will have a certain taste, a smell, a color, and so on. So how do I bring that together in a conceptual space?
Well, one of my key notions is that of a domain. I mean, we have several domains that we organize the knowledge. Color is one, size is another, shape is a third, temperature, and so on. We have a lot of, some of them are based on perception, some of them are based on action, some are based on our social grounding in the society. So there is this general notion of domain that mm-hmm. is used to sort up the information.
So you would not so much see it as, let's say, dimensions spanning this space, but a number of domains, or is that equivalent?
Each domain could consist of a number of dimensions, and color domain is 3-dimensional,
okay.
And taste dimension,
mm-hmm.
taste domain is 4 or 5-dimensional.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So are these domains like a Kantian prior? You're just born with it?
Partly. I mean, it's my theory is neo-Kantian,
mm-hmm.
if you really want to bring in the philosophy here. Kant said that we are born with space and time. I say that we are born with this, we are disposed to have representations of space. We learn time much later. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, there are many domains that are dependent on us being in a culture and learning to discriminate new things and so on. Mm-hmm. So our set of domains are expanding as we grow up in a society. Okay, and they can change over time.
So it's some mixture, if you want.
It's a mixture.
So there's a so is there then really a defined set of prior domains?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, we are born with certain sensory organs
mm-hmm.
that determine some of the basic domains, mm-hmm. like color perception, like perception of heat, and mm-hmm. The tastes, and so on. But on top of these, we build a number of domains. Mm-hmm. I mean, we extract other types of information.
Okay.
For instance, I mean, I have been emphasizing our perception of forces. We are quite good at seeing forces in mm-hmm. People's motions and so on.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have our domains. And then you say, look, if I now see an apple, then I have a number of domains. I might have a visual domain, and a haptic domain, an olfactory domain, mm-hmm. And a taste domain. And now across these domains, apples are a set of data points in that multidimensional space. Mm-hmm. So I have a cluster of data points, and I say all these data points together, this cloud of data points, this is now Apple.
Yep.
This would be the idea.
It's a point in a very high dimensional space,
right.
But the space is organized along a number of domains.
Right, exactly. But now, would there be a way to, let's say, reorganize that space? Like, for instance, you might sometimes discover that, let's say, Santa Claus doesn't exist. So suddenly one organizational element of my reality has disappeared, and now I have to reorganize all my data. So how does that work in a conceptual space?
First of all, you can add new domains. You can learn about apples having nutritional value or something like that. But what happens quite often in learning new things is that you change the importance of domains, which are the most important in making the classifications. So in biology, maybe the behavior of an animal was more important when you classified something as a fish. But then came the biologist and say that no, it's the skeletal structure or how you feed your kids or whatever. Other variables that are more important in zoological classification.
Yeah, but then I was more worried about the case if I lose a domain, not about adding domains, but if I lose one. That's why I thought about Santa Claus. Right?
Yeah, but Santa Claus is not a domain. I mean, it's a fictional object. Yeah, I don't know of any good examples of losing domains. Yeah.
Well, imagine that I believe that, let's say, physical objects move in the world because they have intentional states.
Yeah.
And then I discover that actually stones don't have intentional states. Now, suddenly, my world, the way I frame the world is changing.
Okay, I would describe that as the domain that maybe not disappear, but you assign it a very low value. I mean, it becomes as a zero in your concept classification. I mean, to take an example from chemistry, you had some idea of the caloric dimension that was used to classify chemical stuff. And then suddenly there was a revolution in chemistry and the caloric dimension totally disappeared. I mean, you can find examples of that in the history of science. In the history of human perception or in human classification, it's maybe more difficult to find such changes.
So now I have this cloud of points in Apple space. And now, if I understand your proposal, then you say, and if you want, the center of gravity of that cloud of data points is now my prototype of an apple, right?
Yes, and that cloud is, I make the assumption that it's a convex region. I mean, a concept apple corresponds to a convex region, meaning that for any 2 points in the region, all points in between are also there. And that is very useful in helping us understand how we can learn concepts. To have this notion of convexity,
but it does mean that you're clearly that's a very empiricist view on prototypes and concepts that are really derived from, if you want, data points obtained from the world.
Yes and no. I mean, it's empiricist, and once you have the domains, it's data driven how you divide the spaces into regions. But the domains are the neo-Kantian position that they are partly given, partly learned.
Okay. But now, how should I think about the development of these? Imagine I want to add a new domain. So the discovery of a new domain could be the result of just adding data points to my conceptual space and discover that I cannot organize these data points anymore. And I have to say, I should now assume there's another domain.
Yeah.
So how does that work? How do you go from single observations and their accumulation to this decision, new domain?
That's normally tough for an individual. I mean, here in our society, we have scientists who say that we need in this dimension, this domain, in order to understand the difference between this and that. I mean, so you can do it as an individual, but it's very tough. I mean, you're living in a culture where there are new ideas about what domains you need to understand something.
Right. But now, do you see this in relation to, let's say, the standard notions of assimilation and accommodation that Jean Piaget would talk about in development?
You can interpret it in that way. I mean, he did never say anything about how these processes work. I mean, he didn't have any model of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation would be just collecting data points, and accommodation would be changing the space. I mean, the structure of the underlying space.
Right, exactly.
So I can model these processes that way. Yeah.
Okay, but now at the core of your, and that's also what you said earlier, at the core of your approach is really a notion of a metric, a topology, then also a quantification of similarity.
Yeah.
Right? So can that really generalize to, let's say, all different levels of let's say, concepts?
No, that's a good question, because for our concept classification is very much dependent on our perceptual mechanism. That's the basic classification. But then we can introduce more abstract concepts, different means, and in particular via language. I mean, you have mathematics and in law, you introduce new concepts by definitions, and we use language to construct new concepts. And there you may get out of the geometric constructions. I mean, I don't know if I can apply my methods there, but they are dependent on being grounded in these more low-level concepts. You can't start from the bottom by defining concepts.
Okay,
you have to ground them in some kind of perceptual domain.
Okay, so you're saying the conceptual space is exposed if you want to both feed forward or bottom up influences, perception, sensation, and top down influences like high level symbolic systems related to language.
Yeah.
And in some sense, what you're saying is that what is most clear for you at this point in time is how this feed forward component actually operates.
Yeah.
And then the top down element is sort of for the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but I have one area that I think is very useful to create new concepts is by using metaphors. So to take an example from science, when you introduce the notion of electricity, you have these notions of current and voltage and so on, new dimensions that you don't perceive. And in order to understand how they work, you can then compare electricity with water running or whatever, and you get some kind of grounding in a perceptual domain in that way. But the electrical dimensions, they live on their own in one sense, so you can formulate them mathematically. Right. Yeah.
But now if you go to domains like, let's say, machine vision, there are lots of methods around for data association, right? These are basic different kinds of methods, adaptive filtering methods and what have you, that try to explain how you can bring data points together in high dimensional space. Is that a rather direct expression of your conceptual space notion, or is there a difference?
Well, you must distinguish between technical solutions of dimension reductions. I mean, you can have lots of data sets, and you can use multidimensional scaling or principal component analysis and so on to reduce and pick out the most important dimensions. But that's a technical solution. Then you have the more biological solution, where you really try to connect the dimensions to some kind of perceptual mechanism or to motor systems or whatever. I mean, and that's two different methods.
Okay. All right. But they're not necessarily, you could imagine that some of these methods would be rather directly implementing these notions of a conceptual space.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no fundamental problem there.
No, it's just a question of how biologically realistic you want to be in your implementation.
Right, exactly. So then, Now we have this idea of a conceptual space, and you've been working on that for quite a while.
Yeah.
And today in your presentation, you were emphasizing two, extensions of this framework, right? So on the one hand, you wanted to capture a notion of action, because so far you had looked more, let's say, static concepts, like apples. And on the other hand, you want to go to language. So let's start with action.
Well, I want to go to language as kind of application of these two. I mean, I want to use conceptual spaces to model the cognitive representation of actions, and I want to use them to model the cognitive representation of events. How do we think of events? What is the structure? Just like we have discovered a three-dimensional color space, I want to understand what is the action space of our in our minds.
Right. Okay. So in a sort of boneheaded way, which I usually tend to follow, I could say, well, it's no big deal. I mean, also action I might be able to classify in some high dimensional space. Let's say different limbs involved, or whether it is just between agents, or it's a single agent, or an action on an object, or whatever, right? So, so why is that straightforward generalization not enough to classify action? What's missing?
Well, what kind of data do you start from? I mean, you can get a lot of data points about the human body moving, but that's a very high dimensional set. You have to reduce the data somehow, and you can use, as I said, just technical ways of doing it. But you can also use data from psychology on how we perceive actions. And then there are experiments showing that we have a kind of hierarchical representation of our bodies. I mean, there is the main body, then we have arms and legs, and we have forearms and lower arms and upper arms, and we have hands and fingers. I mean, you have a hierarchical representation. And an action is a movement in this hierarchical structure. So it's a fairly high-dimensional vector or dynamic vector that represents, and you need a more condensed way of understanding what an action is. Okay, I think that our brains need that kind of reduction.
So it's interesting, right? Because that would mean that you're saying, well, the notion of conceptual space is like a core representational engine, which is modality independent. And then dependent on the perceptual filtering, I can now exploit this mechanism in different ways, right? So this would mean for action that you're saying, well, to map action into a conceptual space, it's basically how I filter action.
Yes.
So I should maybe not look at action in static terms, but I should look at more at its dynamical property.
Exactly.
So how am I going to do that?
I mean, if you see a person walking, I mean, take walking as a typical example here. You don't care about the clothes of the person. You don't care about whether it's hot or cold. You care about the movements of the person. So you abstract away a lot of the domains. And what remains, in my mind, is that you look at what are the forces that the person exerts on his or her own body parts. So I see an action as a pattern of forces. That's my reduction of the domain for actions.
Okay, but
to focus on the forces.
Okay, so also you showed in your talk that, for instance, humans actually need very few cues to extract motion, right? Like biological movement. And as also has been shown by others, like Martin Gies and other people. So how does that help me to get to a notion of force?
Well, I mean, first of all, these examples, I mean, it was Gunnar Johansson who started with this patch-like technique. You only put small lights on the joints of your body, and that's enough, the information you get to identify actions, and you identify them extremely quickly. I mean, it takes 200 milliseconds to see what kind of action it is. It helps because it shows you that all the other features are not necessary. You don't have to see the surface of the person moving. You don't have to see the color. All the other features are gone. So you see the kinematics. And then, of course, you could say, okay, this kinematics, that is what you perceive in an action. But I go one step further and say that, no, it's the changes of the kinematics. I mean, if you talk mathematics, it's the second derivative that bring out the forces. And I would say that when we identify an action, it's more using the forces give us a more coherent and a simpler representation of actions than looking at kinematics.
Okay, so this is interesting, right? So on one hand, look, we have to have a direct perception of change in the kinematics. That's one thing. That's the second derivative. And the direct perception of that change you call a force.
Yeah.
But if I would look at that from, let's say, an engineering perspective, I could say, hey, wait one moment, but that would not map necessarily onto the forces I'm really exerting on the degrees of freedom of that walking human, right? So how do I relate these two now?
Okay, that's a good question, because you have the perceptual input when you see somebody walking, and then you can exert the forces on the body limbs. On the other hand, you have the kinesthetic experiences of your muscle control, and you know that you have to stretch your arm in a certain way to push a door or whatever. And I'm making a tacit assumption here that these two systems map onto one another. This is basically like when I understand when you're talking, I'm somehow representing how you produce the sounds, but I also have to map them on how I produce the sound. It's the same kind of perception and motor action mapping.
Right. Okay. But that would mean I would have great difficulties to understand the walking pattern of a bird, because the bird has a rather different kind of body than I do.
Yeah.
At least according to me. So now the interpretation, the grounding of the forces, as you call them, I observe, will be difficult.
Yeah.
So how do I circumvent that problem?
Well, we understand the movements of other animals less than we do understand ourselves. So there is this generalization problem. On the other hand, I mean, once your brain has learned to extract the second derivatives of movement, you can then see the patterns in movement. I mean, you can see that the patterns of sparrows flying are similar. I mean, they have much quicker wing flapping than if you look at an albatross flying, where it's very slow and much more forceful wing flapping than in a sparrow. So there are differences in the patterns, even in birds, and we can learn to identify them.
Right. But now, wouldn't there be another way to interpret this, where we say, well, what we really learn to classify are these derivatives, and we can call them, let's say, kinematic dynamics, something like this, or kinematic change. And these changes will in the end be brought about causally by forces operating on degrees of freedom. But from a perceptual perspective, I don't care about these forces. I care about kinematic change.
Okay.
So what would be wrong with just saying, look, why don't we call this kinematic change for now?
It's a bit of a tough question because now we've been talking about biological movements as the only type of actions.
Right.
But we humans are not very good. Well, we are good Newtonians in one way that we can do these second derivatives. But our minds are also full of other types of forces, like in social interaction. I mean, I know that somebody is my superior. He or she has a force, can control my actions. I know that I'm attracted to a certain woman, and we describe attraction as a force as well. So we, in our understanding of what causes actions, there are other types of forces than the traditional Newtonian forces. That's why I want to use forces rather than just the movements, the kinematic or the dynamics involved in biological motion.
Okay. But that's interesting, right? Because then what the prediction could be is saying, look, our perceptual systems, as applied to, let's say, many different phenomena, different levels of complexity in the world, are, if you want, assigning a notion of force. They are just inventing, let's say, a pseudo-causal relationship behind the change in the world we observe, which can be completely, beside the real causes of what we observe.
Sure. I mean,
would that be?
That's a good interpretation because our brain is adding these. Let's call them theoretical variables or hidden variables. But this is just like in visual perception. I mean, our eyes are adding the contours of objects. I mean, on the retina, there are no contours, but our brain is adding that in the interpretation of the world. So when we are looking at an action, we are adding the forces as a kind of contour, if you like, of the perception you have.
It would be like a dynamic contour.
It's a dynamic contour, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then that means we should not get too confused about this notion of force.
No, not. You shouldn't restrict it to the physical force.
No. But there's an interesting prediction there, right? Because it really means that this might be a way in which the brain is also imposing an interpretation of the world, and this also, by virtue of that we are so good in recognizing biological motion with minimal cues.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, since you mentioned Kant earlier, I mean, he was saying that we can't help but seeing causes and effects, and I say we can't help but seeing forces. I mean, that's part of doing the causal effect relation.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's very good. So when we have an idea about how to deal with motion, perception of action, but in some sense, it's more like a classification, right? Because now we have these changes in posture. Let's say I change my posture. I call this walking. And it has a certain gait, and then you say, well, and I can detect and classify it because I know how these gaits change over time, right? Therefore, I lean on one leg first and the other, and so on. Yeah. But then I could say, but that's not action, because to talk really about action, there must be an intentional component in this. This is just movement. So how do we get from movement to action?
No, I don't. Okay, that's a philosophical point. I mean, some philosophers would say that an action involves an intention. I don't use that. I don't restrict actions, the notion of an action, to intentional actions. No, I don't. I mean, so I have a more general. Maybe the term is not appropriate, but that's how I use it.
Okay. Yeah. No, look, I was not necessarily going to bicker over it. I just want to understand whether you saw a division there between, let's say, movement, pattern, action, but basically you say, look, for me, this is, as long as we're changing the body, that's what I want to recognize. Yeah. Okay. So now we have a way to, let's say, directly perceive features of movement so that we can map them in the conceptual space. Now, what are the domains of that conceptual space to organize representations of action?
Yeah.
So what are the domains?
The domains are the force pattern. I mean, these are the forces. They can be complicated because you have a body moving is a complicated structure of forces. So it's a pattern, but the domain is still this more general notion of force. And my claim is that when we classify actions, I shouldn't say it's only that, because there could be constraints coming from other things. If I hammer something, I use an object, and I can't be hammering with my nose. I can be hammering with my hand, but that's a kind of metaphorical use of hammer. Hammer means that kind of action is involving an instrument, so it's constrained by having an object that functions as a hammer. I mean,
right?
Yeah. Maybe not the best example, but something in that direction.
But then still, what are the domains? I mean, what's the dimensionality of this space? Because is it like the limbs I'm using? Is it the direction of movement in some Cartesian coordinate system? What are these core domains? Is it body types?
Okay. We've been talking mainly about biological motion, but a car has a sort of pattern force. You can accelerate and decelerate the car and so on. And there, of course, in physics, there are generators of forces. I mean, motors or muscles or whatever. But I think that when we perceive actions, when we categorize action, we extract from that. I mean, a robot walking has a totally different system of generating the forces than a human walking, but we would still classify it as the same action. That means I can. My claim is that we can abstract away from the mechanism behind the forces and just focus on the forces.
Okay, all right. So, but then it still remains to be seen how that force space is exactly structured.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we've
it depends on the parts of the acting individual, the acting object. I mean, how many force generators there are and how they are related, like our muscles in our body, for instance, which is complicated.
But it's interesting, right? If you take the car example and let's say ourselves, motoring around, if you want, or navigating the world. You could, indeed, and I mean at an abstract, more Cartesian level description, you say, okay, I'm changing my position in space, and that's the level where these forces act, and I don't really care whether the wheels are turning or the legs are moving, right? So this would make that point about abstraction.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we have an idea of conceptual space, how we can use this to understand action or represent action, heavily relying on, let's say, a transformation of action in the real world to an internal sense of force, if you want. Yeah? But now you also elaborated the same framework towards the notion of an event, right? Which is rather critical in how we deal with the world, because we don't only have dynamics, we also have an event. So
I have not been able to find very many cognitive theories of events. There are lots of philosophical theories, but if we think about the cognitive, I mean, the most naive description of an event is something happens to something. And then this something I call a patient. This is what is in the focus of the event. And then there is something that causes a change, and there is a result of it. I mean, in most cases, something happens. So I divide an event into two vectors. One describing the forces that apply to the patient, and the other vector describing the change in the patient. Sometimes the change is null, but it's still it can be a state. But so my basic model of an event are two vectors: one force vector, one result vector, acting on a patient. Very often there is an agent generating the force vector involved in the event, but there need not be. It can be just gravitation or some other non object generating force.
Right. But now so this is nice, right? So we have the notion of event, and we have decomposed it in, let's say, an agent and a patient, which, let's say, are some core entities who are sort of physically present, defining the event. And then we have exchanges between them, which are the forces, and these are the two vectors, right? So we have a cause and effect. But is that really the minimal description of an event? We might have events where there's no agent that is causing anything.
No, the minimal is a patient and a force and a result vector. This is my hypothesis. I mean, this is a theory, and there has some consequences in how we perceive actions. For instance, I mean, we would be very surprised if something happens without the cause. I mean, that's the Kantian notion again. I mean, if we see something happen, we presume that there is some kind of action pattern going on in behind the screens.
Right. But if nothing happens, we can still describe an event in which, in some sense, nothing happens.
Well, there are two kinds of nothing happening.
Okay.
And one is just that there is no force, and consequently there is no change either, no result vector. So it's just a state, and that's a special case of an event, a fairly boring case of an event.
Sure.
But then there are also events where there is a force and a counterforce that balance each other, so still nothing happens. So when I'm pushing a door and the door doesn't open, I mean I'm exerting a force and the door exerts a counter force. Nothing happens, but there is still an interplay of forces, and there is still an action from my side of pushing the door, but the counter force brings out no effect.
Okay, but if the event is let's say more abstract, where we say, in 2012, the Summer Olympics happened in London, took place in London, right? So does that mean that I would have to decompose that in all sorts of microscopic elements where I can now again recover these force relationships?
In this case, it's a lot of intentionality going on. I mean, lots of people involved in this event, and their joint intentionality constitutes the creation of the Summer Olympics. It's a very complex event involving, I mean, a complex factor of mental causes, not physical causes, generating this event. I don't know how to analyze this in detail. Okay. I mean, I stick to the more concrete actions.
Right. Okay. No, but this is interesting, right? Because this issue of generalization is a challenge right now for the framework.
Yeah,
right?
Of course it is. I mean, going up to these more abstract types of events that we talk about that are generated by our societal structure, by our interactions with other people.
Right.
I mean, I don't really have a good analysis. I mean, this is the kind of program I have. I hope to be able to extend it, but I start with the more basic concrete actions where involve physical forces and so on. Yeah.
No, but moreover, of course, it's sort of an easy game to sort of throw these pot shots at you and say, "Oh, here I have an exception." So, and that's I think not really the point, right? It's really the point to try to understand where would be, let's say, principled transitions of the approach. That's why I thought Olympics might be sort of abstract enough that could be challenging.
It is.
Now we can now decompose, let's say, events in a patient. Why did you use the word patient for, let's say, the core object in the event?
Well, that's something that undergoes the change, so to speak. I mean, sometimes the agent is identical with the patient. When I'm walking, I'm exerting a force on myself, and I'm changing my own position. So there are cases where the agent and patient are identical. But in many cases we can separate them, or in most cases.
Okay, so now, is there any psychological or neuroscientific grounding for this decomposition of an event?
That's a very good question. I don't know a very good answer to it yet. Okay. I mean, there are some people who are speculating about. I mean, we have the two visual pathways in the brain. I mean, the more dorsal is going for the motion patterns, and you can think of that as picking out the kinematics. And maybe I don't know if we can find some correlates of picking out the forces, but that I have no idea. And then you have the more ventral pathway going to object identification, which is more involved in the static properties of objects. So you have a little bit of division of the forces and the objects in, but I mean that's on a very rough and general scale. I don't know if there is more detailed knowledge here.
But now, so in the face of that challenge, and in some sense, you're using very physical metaphors, right? With force, cause, effect. And is that not limiting the framework? Because as soon as we talk about these more, let's say, metaphorical causes, or about intentions, let's say, it might become confusing if we want to think about those as a cause, right? If I ask you, like, please give me this cup of coffee, Peter, to really start to think about that in terms of causes can also get very confusing. Because then, mechanism. My larynx is doing stuff. Sound pressure waves hit your cochlea, etc. Right? And then but Peter grew up in this culture where these words mean certain things. But it sounds like a very, very unfruitful way to pursue the question. So wouldn't it be more useful to say, replace the notion cause and effect to something a bit more neutral?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, by having these force vectors or result vectors, that's in my opinion, it's a way of reducing causes and effects to something that I can describe in semi-mathematical models.
Okay, but then force would then be broadened to something like a metaphorical force.
Yeah, well, as I say, social forces, emotional forces, would be included in this notion.
Are there other concepts we could consider for this? Maybe it's a bit a boring question, but it can lead to so much confusion, right? If we use these physical metaphors.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether are the candidate concepts for this we could consider, or really not really.
I don't know. I mean, some people talk about powers rather than forces, social powers, and so on. I don't know whether that's better or not. I mean, I don't care very much about the terminology here. I mean, I care about what kind of models I'm using. And as we talked about earlier, I mean, my use of action may not fit with the philosopher's uses of action.
But that's not your main concern.
That's not my main concern.
Okay, very good. So we got events sorted. But also you would make the point that this decomposition of events would hold in principle at any level of description. So whether I talk about the cup falling from the table or me writing a paper, the basic decomposition of agent, force, patient, and then a resultant vector or force. Yeah. Would hold.
Yeah, that's a minimal description. Then many events involve more components. I mean, if I hit something with a hammer and I have the instrument as between my force exertion and the force that happens to the object I'm hitting, and I can have if I give something to you, I mean, there is a physical movement of the cup. If I give you my coffee, but there is also the transfer of possession, I mean, which is a much more advanced and intentional part of the action. So there are different details, so different components you can add in an event description. Right. But the basic ones are the two vectors and the patient. I mean, and I would say that this is a cognitive theory, so that these parts appear in all our representations of theories. Then you can go down on finer details and add more components, depending on what level of description you're aiming for.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but now, if we decompose events in these terms, you could imagine that we could expose humans to, let's say, event descriptions. We put them in a scanner, fMRI, and we see which areas of the brain light up, and then hopefully you see 4 different areas where you can say, okay, agent and 2 forces. And is there anything like that?
I think so. I mean, people have been looking at how verbs are represented in the brain, and we are getting into verbs now. I would look for differentiations between these force vectors and the result vectors. If the brain lights up in different areas, depending on whether you talk about the causes or whether you talk about the effects. I don't know if we can find any clear results. I've taken part in a small experiment on this where there are some indication that we can make such a division. But there is a lot of research to do on this. I mean, what happens, and does the brain distinguish between causes and effects in its analysis? That's for me a very interesting question, but I don't know anything about the answer.
Well, actually, very basic learning mechanisms like classical conditioning have been interpreted in terms of the brain extracting cause-effect relationships from the world, right? Because you get exposed to, let's say, the tone, and there comes the foot shock. Right, and in some sense, you might interpret that as a causal relationship.
That's true. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So there have been relatively interesting theories about this, and it would be very consistent with what you're proposing.
Okay, but that's an area I don't know very much about.
Okay,
yeah.
So indeed, but now you mentioned language, because this, I think, is sort of, if you want, the long-term ambition of this program is also to account for language.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that's I shouldn't say the main application, but the application I'm working on right now.
But why do you call it an application?
Because I use this model. I mean, it's a model. I can use it to analyze causes and effects, how we perceive causes and effects. I can use it to analyze how we use verbs. I can maybe use it to analyze social interaction. I don't know what. But at the moment, I'm focusing on how this maps onto our understanding of language.
Okay, but before we go to language, there's an interesting implication of that, no? Because then you're saying, well, from a cognitive perspective, there's a core meaning system organized in conceptual spaces. And this meaning system is sort of modality independent, and now it can be expressed in language. It can be used in how we interpret the world through haptics, vision, blah, blah, blah. But this is like an independent meaning module.
Yes, well, independent meaning, but it is a kind of core module. I mean, the event representation, I think, would be at the core of our understanding of the world. And it depends on I mean, you can have it to analyze perception. You perceive an event, but you can also use it as a basis for formulating a linguistic expression. You can use it for different things. And as you say, I mean, it's modality independent. That, I mean, I don't assume a separate module for language semantics and another module for representing perceptual concepts. I mean, for me, they are on the same
but
system.
That's an interesting, a really important consequence is I can use this meaning system to also make predictions.
Oh, yes.
And I can, because it's modality independent, I can make cross-modal predictions.
Yes.
Right. So that I think that
and these cross-modal predictions show up in language in terms of metaphors.
Right. Exactly.
And they show up in body movement, in how we gesture or how we mimic things or stuff like that.
Okay. So given that we were both very enthusiastic about this program, how far did you get in accounting for language with it?
I'm not to the details. I mean, I've got into some of the rough stuff. And if I start at the very basic level, I mean, all languages, I mean, the syntactic structures of languages are quite different, but all languages seem to have noun phrases and verb phrases. I mean, that's the basic thing you can have. And that division, I mean, linguists never explain why noun phrases and verb phrases exist. I mean, why are these the basic building components of language? They are taken for granted. Now, given the model of events that I have presented, noun phrases map onto agents and patients. Primarily, they might map onto instruments and other stuff. But basic uses of noun phrases is to denote agents and patients. And different basic uses of verb phrases is to denote force vectors and result vectors. So this division between the two objects and the two vectors maps onto the division between noun phrases and verb phrases.
Right. Okay, but how clean is that mapping?
I don't know how clean it is, but if it serves as a grounding for learning language. And this is, I mean, I don't think I can explain all features of human, the semantics of a human language, because that's very rich. But if I can say something about the general principles of how the semantics is structured, I can use that to explain how children can learn a language. Because you need, I mean, the data you get as a child is not very rich. You need some kind of constraints. And these event structures, if my model of the cognitive representations of events are correct, they give you a structure that constrains what words can refer to. I mean, I make this basic distinction between noun phrases and verb phrases.
But now, of a verb, you said, look, a verb is essentially a convex region in a single domain. Yeah. Right? So that seems a rather strong statement.
Yeah. I mean, before we get to that, I mean, let me start by saying that a verb means either refers to the force vector, or it refers to the result vector.
That's right.
You don't have a single verb. I mean, you can have compositions with prepositions and stuff like that where you get, but the root of a verb is my hypothesis, refers to either the force vectors. And these verbs are what we call manner verbs, how you do things. You hit things, you pull and you push. And then you have verbs that refer to the result vector. And these are, well, results like painting or heating or whatever, opening.
Yeah, but wait, if it's a verb, it always requires an agent. But if it's an agent, it requires that... But look, if we have the patient now, and the patient undergoes a change, let's say you hit my finger with a hammer, my finger turns purple. The result vector is not necessarily an action as I can capture in a verb.
No.
Right? So,
Well, you say turns purple. I mean, that's you have turning here means, and then you have the color term. So what happens is that turn means a change or a movement.
No, but you agree. I could describe it in a way that there's no verb involved. I said you hit, and now, my finger is blue. Well, the property change.
Yeah, there's
a property change.
Yeah, there's a property change.
So how do I? Well, this is not in itself an action of the patient. Right? It's a property change.
Yeah, it's a property change, but that's the result vector. And it's described. I mean, you can say turns red, turns purple. You can say becomes purple. We have those verbs that help us in saying that there is a change in a property, and purple is a property word. But you're saying it's going from some other color into the region of purple. So there is a change in the result. The result vector is going from some region into the purple region. That's the result vector.
Yeah. So what I was after was just trying to understand whether you're saying verbs describe change or verbs describe action.
No. There are two kinds. There are verbs that describe actions. These are the manner verbs. And then there are verbs that describe changes. And I say there is a fairly tight division between them. There are some verbs that can be used for both topics, but in a particular sentence, they're used either to describe the manner, the force vector,
right.
or
but this is, I was trying to understand, let's say, the overlap between these two domains, because you could say, look, you lift the hammer and now the patient ran away. So now I'm acting. So I'm not turning blue anymore. Right. So how unique is that mapping of these two kinds of verbs to either the cause or the effect?
I would say it's fairly, I mean, of course, there is a particular action can have very many different outcomes, as you say. I mean, depending on the situation and on the context. But we don't have verbs that summarize causes and effects. I mean, this is my constraint on how we learn these verbs. They either express the cause, I mean, the force vector, or the effect of an event. So that's a kind of cognitive prediction here.
But for instance, you could be running towards me, and I'm running away. So we're both running. Yeah. The agent and the patient are both running. So the verb we use to now describe the cause and effect is the same. Yeah. Is that a problem?
No, because you use the preposition away.
All right.
Which introduces a result into the run away is you modify the manner by running away that introduces a change in space, which is a result vector. By having this preposition added to running, you're changing it from a manner vector to a result vector.
Okay, but I could also say Peter's running and Paul is running.
Yeah, but then you don't have it as a cause and effect. And you have to.
Okay, but then
it's two events. It's two events.
But you did bring in the proposition now, so then it becomes, let's say, a conglomerate.
Yeah,
it's not only the verb anymore.
No. It's a. I mean, there has to be at least one vector and one agent or patient. I mean, so that's the noun phrase and the verb phrase are the minimal elements of an event description.
Okay. Okay. So it's a phrase. It's not just a single verb.
No.
Okay.
It can. I mean, then you add grammar, but I mean, and all kinds of compositions of descriptions. But what is denoted by these composite expressions are agents and patients.
Okay, so now we have these two kinds of verbs, and then from that you came with the prediction, if you want. But you can say, okay, if I look at that from the perspective of the conceptual space, it means that if every verb is indeed in the convex region, they cannot sort of be in two disjoint regions at the same time, and therefore, let's say, cause and effect verbs. There are no occurrences of verbs that are both cause and effect.
No, and as a matter of fact, you can make it even stronger, because among the result verbs, they only refer to a single domain. So when you're heating something, you're changing the temperature. When you're moving something, you're changing the spatial location. And when you're painting something, you're changing the color domain. I mean, I had previously a theory about adjectives that say that adjectives refer to regions in single domains. So you have the color words, color adjectives that refer to the color space. You have the temperature, hot and cold, I refer to temperature, and so on. Now I'm generalizing this single domain hypothesis also to verbs, and there are lots of potential counterexamples. I don't know how well this hypothesis will hold up, but if it does, it shows a very nice parallel between the structure of adjectives and the structure of verbs,
right?
Which would be nice from a cognitive point of view. From the point of view of cognitive economy, I should say. Yeah.
On the other hand, you have some wiggle space, right? Because you have a free parameter in your model, which is the domain itself. Okay, so the point is, even if you find counterexamples, they raise interesting questions about really the structuring of these domains.
Well, but I'm saying that at least that the same domains apply to adjectives that apply to verbs, and we find these nice mappings between movement verbs and change and position adjectives and stuff like that. So,
but now one problem I had with that prediction is that I could also argue, well, look, sure thing, this is not a big surprise, because let's say in general, words used in a language that are ambiguous and confusing will just die out because they don't help for pragmatical terms. Yep. So in that sense, could I say, well, this is like this is a truism, because of course words in our language are only there because they're not ambiguous.
Yeah, I would say you can think of it as a truism, but The reason is that if you have too complicated words, I mean words with too complicated semantics, they would not would be very difficult to learn, and having them sorted up into referring to a single domain makes them easier to learn. And I think that this is a good constraint on that explains how children can pick up language so quickly as they do. I mean, that's one of the constraints, and it's not the only one.
But your prediction is that language have evolved the way they did, also to facilitate learnability.
Oh yes, and I mean, there are these famous Chomsky arguments of the paucity of the data. I mean, we don't get enough data. We have to have innate structures. I don't think that's a very strong argument because he only considers syntax in his studies. Right. If you look at the interplay between perception and language, and as I've been doing in my studies of actions and events, I mean, you can generate a lot more constraints on learning, and that's what one of my aims is, to identify these constraints on how the semantics of words are structures.
Yeah, but what's interesting about this argument about the poverty of the stimulus originating in the 1950s, that in some sense the data is still out there. I mean, the data has not really been conclusively, summarized in some way. That indeed the sensory stimuli the growing child is exposed to is that restricted or not structured enough to allow learnability. But then what kind of data do you have to support your position here?
No, I mean, the data I have comes from to the extent I can confirm my models here. That, I mean, I have to look at for instance, the verbs. I mean, to see whether this classification between manner verbs and result verbs hold water. And that's a hot topic in linguistics at the moment. And if it does, I mean, then we have some data showing that there is this kind of division of meanings in verbs. And that division of meanings would generate a constraint that can help me in explaining why kids can learn language so easily.
Okay, but that would mean that the structuring of the conceptual space of language should then coincide with the progression of language learning.
Yeah, I mean, that's some give and take relation.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you really see that feedback mechanism? Because there must be some bootstrapping in this, right? Because the argument is always, look, if it's just feed forward and you grab it from the world, it's not enough.
No.
So what are these key rules that would help the bootstrapping in this? Do you have an idea about that?
I have thought a little bit about the ordering in which you learn domains as a child. I mean, you learn the shape of objects quite early. You interact with things with your hands and your mouth and so on. Color comes perhaps later. You learn about spatial relations. But then there are lots of spaces where you only learn things later. And I looked a little bit at child data on when certain domains are learned. So color and shape comes very early. But for instance, all the domains related to knowledge, I mean, knowing, believing, and lying, and so on. Children normally don't learn them until they're about 3 or 4 years old. So that's a more abstract domain that comes later. Or take economic terms. I mean, like a loan or a inflation, to take a tough word. I mean, you can't teach a child that. Bailout. You can't, because for kids, money are coins and bills. And they don't know about this abstract space of economic relations. That's something that they learn much later. So my idea of some kind of progression of domains would help. It would be another constraint on language learning. Okay. Some domains come earlier in their development, and then via learning a language, via being part of a culture, you learn further, more abstract domains.
But then your prediction is that there must be a hierarchy of conceptual spaces.
A hierarchy of domains, yes.
Of domains?
Yeah.
Okay. And would that hierarchy, let's say, also be an explosion in dimensionality, or not necessarily?
Well, each new domain adds a dimension, so it's bringing out more dimensions.
Yeah, yes. But it could also collapse dimensions of preceding domains, right? Because
it could, yeah, but yeah. No, I think in general our minds are growing in the number of dimensions we are using.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then you had a number of predictions, if you want, about verbs, right? So for instance, that similarities in verb meaning, or the subcategories of verbs, or the subregions, like the subregions in the notion of walking.
Yeah.
Right. So what are these predictions exactly?
Well, we categorize. I mean, one idea behind conceptual spaces is that similarity plays a great role in categorization. So we categorize colors as yellow because they are similar in our perception, and we categorize actions because they are similar in our perception. So I would say that running is very much similar to walking, or more similar to walking than running is to flying, for instance. Yeah, that's a good example. And we use these similar. I mean, I don't have a measure of distance between force patterns, but somehow the force pattern of running is more similar, closer to that of walking than it is to flying. And we use these similarities when we judge the similarities between verb meanings. And also, if you can generalize, I mean, take walk again. There are a number of subdivisions of walking. You can be limping, you can be marching, you can be strutting, and I mean, there are lots of kinds of walking. But they all fall under the general notion of the walking domain of possible walking patterns, force patterns. But the subdivisions then are subregions of this action space.
Right, and that would then coincide with, say, our ability to distinguish these movement patterns.
I mean, this is just like we have subdivisions of nouns. I mean, you can have an animal, a dog, a terrier. I mean, you have this hierarchy. We have the similar hierarchy of action representations.
Okay, and then then you would also, but you also had, let's say, a more detailed decomposition of, let's say, how verbs translate to action in the world. Because if we take the example of push that you talked about, to push an object in itself is not necessarily the complete story, right? Because in the result vector, different things can happen.
Yeah.
Right. So does that mean I also have to think about then subcategories, or no, let's say a decomposition of push into different kinds of resultant vectors, or not?
You must make a distinction between what the verb represents and the event you're describing, because the verb represents a force vector. Pushing is a force vector, normally horizontally towards an object. But then the object may be stuck or may be heavy, or so nothing happens. But that's part of the event. I mean, that's the result vector. But the push it as the verb only concerns the force vector, and the result may be a complicated story depending on how the world looks like.
But how do I segment this now? Because imagine, so you push me and I'm pushing you back.
Yeah.
So I'm your patient and you're my patient.
Yeah. Right? Then there are two events.
Okay, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So so the segmentation of, let's say, real world events, right? This segmentation would fall along the lines of the forces and how they're exchanged.
Yeah.
But would that decomposition be unambiguous?
No, not necessarily.
Does it need to be unambiguous?
Yeah.
Does it need to be unambiguous?
You can have different levels of description of events. I mean, if you take wrestling, I mean, there is a continuous exchange of forces.
Right, exactly.
But we still generalize this general pattern of two people pushing against or pulling against each other as a general type of interaction. So that's a high-level description. Then, of course, I can have a more detailed description of a wrestling match. I can have, I'm bending your knee or bending your arm or pushing there or lifting there or whatever. I mean, there are lots of sub-events in this global event.
But is the prediction of this possibly that if the forces cancel each other out, or if the roles of patient and agent cancel each other out, that is a necessary reason to step to a next level of abstraction?
No. I mean, it's just when you're describing a scene around you, you can say, well, I'm in a room. But I can also say I'm in a room with this and that pieces of furniture. I mean, I can go down and talk about the details. I mean, it's a level of attention we have on a particular situation.
Okay. So now you came a long way with the conceptual spaces approach to understand language, right? So in some sense you're saying nouns are categories.
Yeah.
Right? Adjectives are properties. Prepositions are force and spatial relations, so sort of relationships. Verbs now are forces and results, causes and effects.
Vectors, yeah.
Right? And then adverbs are like modifying vectors.
Yeah.
What would that exactly mean in
well,
this context?
if I push something,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm asserting a vector, but I'm not saying very much about how strongly I push. I mean, the strength. If I say I push strongly, I'm saying that the vector I'm exerting belongs to the with stronger forces, I exert more force. So it's like a multiplier or a modifier of a vector.
Okay.
Or I can change the direction. I say I pushed downwards. That means I'm saying it's changing the direction of the pushing.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, so in that sense, you have a very complete, if you want, decomposition of this very basic notion of an event, right, in the atoms of language. And then your proposal is that sentences as such, as a unit, capture the event.
Yep.
Right? Yep. But now to go from these linguistic atoms to a sentence, we need grammar. Right?
Not necessarily. I mean, we can communicate without grammar quite a lot. I mean, there is this thing that's called proto-language. That is just meaning components without any grammar. I think grammar is needed to disambiguate a lot of things here. I mean, in English, for instance, there are a lot of words that can mean either a verb or an object. I like hammer. I mean, hammer is a verb or it could be an object. And the word in isolation doesn't tell you what it is. But if you put it in a context and add syntactic markers, tenses or third-person markers or whatever, then you can see whether it's a noun or a verb. So syntax for me is a tool to disambiguate the uses of words. And then syntax is another constraint on how to learn a language, because the syntactic markers will help a child to see whether we're talking about an action or we're talking about an object.
Yeah, but what I find surprising about this, and that's probably because you're more aware about the intricacies of language, but I would expect that you would have said something like, well, I have my basic decomposition of an event. I have an agent, I have my two vectors, and I have a patient. So cause and effect. And it's that order of an agent, cause and effect on the patient. It's that order that translates to syntax.
No, not necessarily.
Why
because,
not?
Because there is an event or an element in between. There is an event. But there is also you looking at the event and you focusing on something. I mean, you're looking at what the agent is doing, or you're looking at what the patient is doing. That two different foci on the event, and that attention focusing shows up in language. So in what's large class of languages, the subject turns out to be the thing you're focusing on. So if I say that I'm hitting you, I'm focusing on me doing the action. But if I'm saying you are being hit, I'm focusing on what's happening to you. I'm making you the subject. And in both cases, I'm the patient. I'm the agent. You're the patient. So what becomes the subject of a sentence is determined by what is the focus of attention on the event.
Yeah, but look, exactly this example I think is a good one. I mean, you might have reached a stage in this discussion that you want to hit me, but still we say Peter is hitting Paul.
Yep.
So first we have the agent, then we have the cause, and then we have the patient. And if it's the other way around, we say Paul is hitting Peter. So it's that ordering in the language that is rather directly correlated with the ordering of your event decomposition.
Not necessarily.
No?
I mean, first of all, there are all kinds of orderings between subject, object, and verb in languages, so that doesn't. But I think the most important thing is just what is your focus of attention. That's what determines the ordering, because the thing most focused on comes first.
Yeah, but isn't that now a tricky direction to take? Because now you bring in for the first time, let's say, a point of view, and you say, dependent on the point of view, you reorganize the conceptual space. You reorganize the event structure. But it shouldn't really matter, because independent of the point of view, the event structure always has the agent, the cause, the patient, and the effect. No,
you don't reorganize it. You focus on it, and then you turn this focusing into a linguistic expression. So this is an intermediary step between your event perception and how you describe it. And between your perception, there is the focusing of attention, and that determines partly how you assign syntactic roles to the parts of the event.
This is interesting, right? So now, I find this interesting because on the one hand, you're saying, look, if you want a cognitive representational perspective, I can tell you how an event is represented, is decomposed. Yeah. So there we go. We have the agent and our cause, the patient effect. Then you say those components I can map on the components of language.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we're still doing fine. So this is like we have our conceptual space, the domains, and there we go. And we map this to, let's say, components of language. And then now we want to make a sentence. And you're saying the whole sentence describes the whole event.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the sentence describes an aspect of an event. You have to pick out a certain aspect of an event. And you can start very basically with a subject and a verb. But then you can add prepositional phrases, you can add modifiers, you can add, I can say that I hit you, but I can say I hit you strongly with a hammer. I hit you strongly with a hammer so your eyes became blue and so on. I can expand the description of the event by adding more and more parts of the event.
So but that means that I have now a transformation. I have to look at some transformation that goes from, let's say, a neutral mapping into a conceptual space of an event, as it is in the outside world. Then I want to translate this to language, and for that I have to make a transformation. And this transformation depends on the point of view.
Well, you make a selection, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
But in making this selection, I still map it into your basic event structure.
Yep.
No?
Yes.
And so to map that basic event structure in language, I still face the same problem, which means there's an agent, a cause, a patient, and an effect.
The event structure will constrain language. It will not determine what you say, but it will constrain the structure of your language.
But then where's the magic of coming in of the syntax? Because still, this is how I have to map it to my sentence.
But of course, as I said, you have to have some way of disambiguating the role. So you have to decide whether something is a verb or a noun, for instance, or whether something is talking about spatial relations or whatever. You can do a lot with proto-language without syntax. And when children are learning language, they start with the proto-language. The grammar comes most of the grammar comes much later.
Right.
And if you start communicating in another foreign language, you start without the syntax. You have a vocabulary and you try your best.
Right.
So this is the proto-language structure of communication. For me, syntax is just a tool for helping us in getting more better understanding how you made the transformation for the event description to the linguistic expression.
Okay. So Peter, to wrap up, I have two questions. So you're going around in this sort of very cognitive view on the mind, if you want, and its different capabilities, proposing this notion of cognitive of conceptual spaces for a while now, looking at its consequences, and that seems to be panning out rather well. So what would be Peter's law that we have to adhere to in trying to understand the mind?
Well, one important thing is that our mind divides information into domains. That's for me. I don't have a crisp definition of what is a domain, but I can give you examples. And this domain structure shows up in a lot of circumstances. So that's one of the big messages I have.
Okay. And then the second one is 5 years from now, I'm going to go visit you in Lund and say, okay, you gave me this prediction 5 years ago, and now I want to know whether it really happened. So what's the one prediction you feel most passionate about today? A prediction, testable prediction. That you're gonna see tested and validated 5 years from now.
I have lots of smaller predictions. I have predictions about how the semantics of children develop. I can tell you about the order of adjectives they will learn, for instance. I have predictions about what will be easy to teach to a robot and more difficult to teach in terms of verbs.
Give me the most exciting one. With the highest chance of failure.
And I haven't thought about formulating. Okay, the highest rate of failure is that nouns in general involve several domains. We talk about dogs, they have sounds and smells and sizes and shapes and whatnot. Other words, adjectives, prepositions, verbs, normally refer to single domains. So if I can validate this hypothesis, I will have a fairly strong toolbox to generate further, more detailed predictions about how language works.
Okay.
I mean, I have this kind of program of extending this single domain hypothesis to different word classes.
Right.
So that's a fairly general
That's
hypothesis.
a good one.
And if that works out,
You'll be very pleased.
I will be very pleased, yes.
Okay, Peter Gardenfors, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.